Welcome back to the Context Education Podcast. If you're enjoying these deep dives into these fascinating topics, hit that subscribe button and share the knowledge. Tell a friend about the show.
Definitely.
Today,
Spread the word.
yeah, spread the word, exactly. Today we're going beyond the headlines to explore a relationship that's often misunderstood, Europe and Africa.
Yeah.
It's about so much more than just history.
So much more.
We're going to uncover the deep intertwining of these continents, from economics and resources to migration and even climate change.
Right.
By the end, you'll see this relationship with fresh eyes, understanding the challenges and the potential for a more balanced future.
It's a complex story that goes way beyond simple headlines.
Right. So let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, Europe's colonial past in Africa.
Yeah.
It's a heavy legacy that continues to shape the relationship today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's impossible to understand the current dynamics without acknowledging that history. But colonialism wasn't just about exploitation. It shaped political systems, established trade networks, and even created cultural ties that are still very much in play today.
Right.
Think about the shared languages like French English and Portuguese,
Yeah.
a direct result of that history.
Oh, yeah.
It makes communication and cultural exchange easier, but it's also a constant reminder of those historical power dynamics.
It's like the language itself is a living artifact of that past.
Yes.
And it makes you wonder how much of what we see today is a direct result of those colonial structures.
It's a question worth pondering. What's fascinating is that even with that complex history, Europe and Africa are deeply reliant on each other in the present.
Okay.
Take resources. For example, Europe depends on Africa for a whole range of crucial materials.
You're talking about things like oil minerals, even those rare earth elements we need for all our tech gadgets, right?
Yes.
I remember reading that Europe gets a significant portion of its cobalt from Africa. And cobalt is essential for those lithium-ion batteries that power everything from electric cars to smartphones.
Exactly. It's a prime example of how Europe's green energy transition is actually deeply linked to Africa's resources.
Yeah.
But it's not just about buying and selling. European companies have massive investments in African mining, agriculture, and energy sectors.
So it's not as simple as Europe just taking resources from Africa. There's a whole economic ecosystem built around those resources.
Precisely. And it cuts both ways. Many African countries rely heavily on European investment and trade for their own economic growth.
It makes you think of that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. But what about the idea that Europe is sending aid to Africa? Is that part of the same complex equation?
Development aid is definitely a big part of the relationship.
Okay.
But as you alluded to, it's a complex issue. While aid can be vital for addressing immediate needs like healthcare and education, there's always the risk of creating dependencies rather than promoting sustainable growth.
It's like walking a tightrope between providing support and empowering nations to chart their own course.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance and moving away from a donor-recipient model towards a more equal partnership. But remember, the relationship goes far beyond just economics. We also have to consider the human element, the movement of people.
Right. Migration is a huge topic when we talk about Europe and Africa. We constantly see it in the headlines.
And those headlines often frame it as a problem for Europe.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that many Africans who migrate to Europe seeking work and opportunity actually contribute significantly to those European economies.
It's a reminder that we're talking about people's lives and aspirations, not just abstract political or economic concepts. And that movement of people highlights how interconnected the continents truly are, despite the geographical distance and the historical baggage.
It's a two-way street, just like with the economic ties. And there's another layer to the population question that often gets overlooked. Africa has a rapidly growing population, one of the youngest in the world.
So what does that mean for Europe? Is it a potential source of labor for aging European societies? Or does it create more pressure for migration?
Yeah.
Or maybe both?
It's a complex question with no easy answers. But understanding those demographic trends is crucial for understanding the future of the Europe-Africa relationship.
Yeah.
It's not just about what has happened in the past. It's about what's happening right now and what's coming next.
It's almost like these two continents are tied together by an invisible thread woven from history, economics, and the very lives of their people. You pull on one end, the whole tapestry shifts.
That's a great way to put it. And to understand the full complexity of that tapestry, we also need to talk about geopolitics. Because believe it or not, that plays a huge role in why Europe can't just leave Africa, even if some people might want them to.
Now that's what I call a cliffhanger. We'll have to dive into the world of geopolitics and explore that question in our next segment. Don't go anywhere, folks. The deep dive continues after the break.
Wow. When we talk about geopolitics, it's easy to think of it as some abstract game played by world leaders. But for you, the listener, it boils down to this: Europe is deeply concerned with what happens in Africa for reasons that hit close to home.
Because instability in Africa could lead to problems that directly impact Europe.
Yes.
Things like terrorism, trafficking, even mass migration.
Exactly. Imagine a scenario where conflict or economic collapse in a North African country triggers a wave of migration across the Mediterranean. It would have huge political and social repercussions for Europe.
And that's not just a hypothetical scenario, right?
Yeah.
We've seen similar situations play out in recent years.
Right. Think about the European Union's efforts to cooperate with African countries on border control and migration management. It's a direct reflection of those geopolitical concerns. But it goes beyond just migration. Some European countries like France still maintain military bases in parts of Africa. It's a legacy of their colonial past, but also a sign of their ongoing security interests in the region.
So even though colonialism officially ended decades ago, those historical ties continue to shape Europe's military and political presence in Africa.
It's a complex legacy that continues to influence the relationship in ways that are sometimes hard to untangle. And then there's the economic dimension of geopolitics. Remember how we talked about those crucial resources Europe gets from Africa?
Right? Things like cobalt, for those batteries we rely on so much.
Well, securing access to those resources is a major geopolitical concern for Europe, especially as global competition for those resources heats up.
You're talking about the rise of China, right? I've read a lot about China's growing influence in Africa and how it's making European countries nervous.
China's Belt and Road Initiative is a perfect example of this dynamic. It's a massive infrastructure project that's pouring investment into Africa, building ports, railways, and roads. It's changing the economic landscape and challenging Europe's traditional influence in the region.
It sounds like a geopolitical tug-of-war with Europe and China vying for influence and access to Africa's resources and markets.
It's a good analogy. And it's not just about economic competition, it's also about soft power, using culture diplomacy and development aid to build relationships and influence decisions. China has been very effective at this, which is raising concerns in some European capitals.
So for Europe, the stakes are high. It's not just about economic interests, it's about maintaining their geopolitical standing in a rapidly changing world.
Precisely. And that brings us back to your earlier question about whether Europe could simply leave Africa. The reality is extricating themselves from this complex web of relationships and interests would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And let's not forget the ethical dimension of all of this.
Right. Given Europe's colonial history, does it have a moral obligation to continue engaging with Africa, even if it's facing these geopolitical challenges?
That's a really thorny question, and there are no easy answers. On one hand, Europe has benefited tremendously from its historical relationship with Africa, often at Africa's expense. So there's an argument to be made that Europe has a responsibility to contribute to Africa's development and address some of those historical injustices.
Especially since many of the challenges Africa faces today, like poverty and instability, are directly linked to that colonial past.
Exactly. But on the other hand, some people argue that Europe's continued involvement, even in the form of aid, can sometimes perpetuate a cycle of dependency and hinder Africa's ability to chart its own course.
So it's a balancing act, trying to find a way to engage responsibly without imposing their own agenda or creating new forms of dependence.
That's the crux of the issue, and it requires moving beyond a purely transactional relationship towards something more equitable and sustainable.
It's like that old saying, give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime.
Exactly. It's about empowering African nations to build their own futures, rather than simply relying on handouts. And that requires a fundamental shift in thinking on both sides.
It sounds like a pretty daunting challenge.
It definitely is. But let's flip the script for a moment. It's easy to get caught up in talking about Europe's role in Africa. But what about the other side of the equation? Why does Africa need Europe? Is it a one-way street?
That's a great point. It's always important to consider both perspectives. I imagine African countries also have their own interests and motivations in maintaining this relationship. What are some of the key reasons why Africa needs Europe?
Well, for starters, Europe remains a crucial economic partner for many African countries. It's a major source of investment, trade, and technology. Remember those European companies we talked about earlier, the ones investing in African mining and agriculture? They create jobs, generate revenue, and contribute to economic growth in those countries.
So it's not just about aid. It's about those economic ties that benefit both sides. It's like a business partnership where each side brings something valuable to the table.
Exactly. Think about it like this. Many African countries are trying to diversify their economies, moving beyond reliance on raw materials and developing their own manufacturing and industrial sectors. To do that, they need access to technology expertise and markets, and Europe can be a key partner in that process.
So while some people might argue that Africa should just cut ties with Europe and go it alone, the reality is that those economic connections are still vitally important for many African countries.
That's right. And it goes beyond just economics. Europe is also a major source of development assistance for Africa. We talked earlier about the potential downsides of aid, but let's not forget the positive impact it can have. European aid supports vital programs in healthcare, education, and infrastructure development, helping to improve lives and build a foundation for future growth.
So while it's important to be critical of how aid is delivered and to ensure it's not creating dependencies, it's also important to acknowledge that it plays a vital role in addressing some of Africa's most pressing challenges.
Absolutely. And beyond the economic and developmental aspects, there's also the security dimension. Many African countries face serious security threats from terrorism and organized crime to armed conflicts and political instability. Europe, with its military capabilities and diplomatic experience, can play an important role in supporting peace and security in Africa.
So it's not just about Europe protecting its own interests in Africa. It's about working together to address shared security challenges.
Right. Think about the European Union's involvement in peacekeeping missions or its efforts to combat piracy off the coast of Somalia. These are examples of how European engagement can contribute to stability and security in Africa, which ultimately benefits both continents. But there's another, often overlooked reason why Africa needs Europe.
What's that?
It's about global governance and diplomacy. Africa needs a strong voice on the world stage, and Europe can be a valuable ally in amplifying that voice. When it comes to issues like climate change, trade negotiations, or international security, having a partner like Europe can help African countries advance their interests and shape the global agenda in a way that benefits them.
So it's not just about what Europe can do for Africa. It's about how Europe can help Africa exert its own influence and shape the world around it.
Precisely. It's about moving beyond a paternalistic relationship towards a more balanced and mutually beneficial partnership. As they say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
I like that. So it seems like this Europe-Africa relationship is a lot more nuanced and complex than many people realize. It's not just about Europe exploiting Africa or Africa being dependent on Europe. It's a multifaceted partnership with both opportunities and challenges.
You're absolutely right. And understanding those nuances is crucial for navigating this relationship in a way that benefits both sides. Now let's move on to another crucial aspect of this relationship. It's a global challenge that affects both continents in profound ways and has the potential to either tear them apart or bring them closer together.
You're talking about climate change, right? I've been waiting for us to dive into this. It's such a massive issue with implications for everything from migration patterns to resource scarcity to the future of entire economies.
Exactly. And when it comes to climate change, Europe and Africa are inextricably linked. What happens on one continent has a direct impact on the other. So in our next segment, we'll unpack the climate change connection and explore how it's reshaping the Europe-Africa relationship in ways that you might not expect. Stay with us, folks, because this is where things get really interesting.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. History, economics, geopolitics, those invisible threads connecting Europe and Africa. But now it's time to tackle the big one, climate change.
Yeah, a global challenge that's really hitting both continents hard, and it's not just some future threat, it's happening right now.
It's interesting because when we think about climate change, it's easy to get caught up in those images of like melting glaciers and, those dramatic shifts.
Yeah.
But it's so deeply connected to those economic and political realities we've been discussing.
Absolutely. Take migration, for example. As climate change makes parts of Africa less habitable, think droughts, desertification, it's going to push more people to look for opportunities elsewhere, and that includes Europe.
So it's like climate change is adding fuel to that migration debate. And it's not just about people moving. What about those resources Europe depends on from Africa?
Well, climate change is really stressing water resources in many parts of Africa. That impacts agriculture, mining operations, even energy production, all those things that are vital not just for African economies, but also for those European industries that rely on those resources.
It's like climate change is throwing a wrench into this already complex machine, making everything more unpredictable and raising the stakes for everyone involved.
Exactly. It underscores the need for cooperation. Both continents got to work together to mitigate the effects of climate change, adapt to this new reality, and find ways to build more resilient economies and societies.
It makes me think of that saying, we're all in the same boat. When it comes to climate change, there are no winners and losers. It affects all of us.
Absolutely. And in a strange way, climate change presents this opportunity for Europe and Africa to forge a new kind of partnership. Think about renewable energy. Africa has vast solar and wind resources that could really help Europe move away from those fossil fuels.
So Europe gets the clean energy it needs.
Yeah.
African countries get to develop their own renewable energy sectors, creating jobs and boosting their economies. Sounds like a win-win.
It's a great example of how tackling shared challenges like climate change can spark innovation and create those opportunities for collaboration and mutual benefit.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Europe-Africa relationship, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What do you hope they'll remember?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is this. This relationship is incredibly complex and it's always changing. There are no easy answers or simple solutions.
Right.
It's not just about Europe leaving or staying in Africa. It's about recognizing those deep interconnections, the shared challenges, and the potential for building a more equitable and sustainable future together.
So moving beyond those simplistic narratives of exploitation or dependency and recognizing that the destinies of these two continents are intertwined in ways that we're only beginning to grasp.
And at the end of the day, it's about remembering that we're talking about real people, millions of people across two continents whose lives are shaped by this complex relationship in countless ways.
So for you, the listener, the takeaway is this. Keep learning. Keep asking questions and keep engaging with this topic because understanding the Europe-Africa relationship is key to understanding the world we live in today and the world we're shaping for tomorrow.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as always, the learning doesn't stop here. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.